All right, folks, welcome back to Manufacturing Month. This is our third session in the Trade Talk Tuesday Export Compliance Series. Today is Tuesday, October 18th, 2022 at 11 o'clock on the East Coast. I'm Tony Sargis with the U.S. Commercial Service out of the Connecticut Export Assistance Center, so I welcome you back to today's session. Today, we'll be discussing screening best practices. And then next week, just a note for next week, we're going to do a session, Ask the Compliance Expert. So I encourage folks, send us questions in advance if you can. I'll be sending an email out this afternoon in response to last week's session and this week's session with some resource documents as I did the first week. So again, I see a lot of people are kind of rolling in now. So send us questions that you have in advance for next week. So next week's session will be strictly Q&A. We'll definitely have some questions queued up, but we'd prefer to take the questions that you have that you would like us to address for that session. Today, we're joined with, again, Jose Abrantes, Senior Manager of Global Trade Compliance at OFS. Alfredo is unable to join us today, but I believe he'll be back with us next week. So thank you for that. Just a couple notes, Q&A. So if you have questions throughout today's presentation, again, it's a quick 20 to 30 minutes. We will not be here any longer than 11:30. The purposes of these trade talks is to be quick, to cover material in a comprehensive manner. And then what we'll do is we'll send some additional resources in follow-up. So you can write questions in the chat and send it to myself and Jose, and we will address those questions throughout and at the end of today's presentation. All right, Jose, I'm going to turn it over to you. I will keep an eye on the Q&A box, and then we will take those questions at the end. Thank you, sir.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for joining us today. Apologize for Alfredo not being able to join. I think it's important that he'll be able to be next week when we're going to ask Q&A with the experts, which he is definitely one that you should pick his brain. So send out those questions ahead of time, and we'll do the best to cover what we can. So today we're talking about screening, and we talked a little bit before in the previous sessions about red flags. So there's different types of screening: country screening, product screening, end use review, red flags, and end user screening. So today really just going to focus on that part of the end user screening. So by order of the United States governments, U.S. individuals and companies are prohibited or restricted from exporting or from providing services of any kind to any party shown in the denied restricted party lists. So additionally, companies must not engage in any transaction with Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and now we actually should have added here, we discussed Belarus, Russia, and occupied regions of Ukraine. Now, the regs do not say that we must screen, right? They don't say you have to screen your customers. All the regs say is that we cannot do business with these individuals. So to ensure that the company does not engage with unauthorized parties, a company must conduct export screening to include, prospective existing customers for software technology servicing against restricted party lists. So I changed to denied party lists to restricted or sanctioned party lists. And they can be used intermingled, but there is a little bit of a difference. So for today, we're talking more of restricted and sanctioned than just denied. So in addition to customers, potential customers, freight forwarders, vendors, banks that issued letters of credit, foreign visitors, consultants, they all must be screened against restricted party lists. So how do you screen? There's three ways of screening possible. Back in the day, I've been doing this for a while, but back in the day, the government, Commerce has some lists, Treasury has others, Department of State has other lists. And if you wanted to do a manual screening, you would actually have to go to each of the sites and do a search that way. There is now a consolidated screening list that the government keeps it together. That is very helpful to if you want to go there and do the screening that way. Most companies use a web-based screening service provider or a ERP-based screening, and there's a big difference between the two of them in terms of cost and how much it entails to implement and so forth. But web-based screening services, there are plenty out there, and what they do, they consolidate all the lists and provide you some kind of a template that you can screen and filter, kind of almost like you do Google search, and come up with the potential matches. ERP-based screening, obviously you implemented the screening embedded into your SAP or your JD Edwards. It's more integrated into your system. It's more efficient, but it's also more costly, depending on how the risk and the amount of screening you're going to be doing. So I did want to, since the slides typically go out, I did want to put the list for the government consolidated screening list here is on trade.gov. That is free of charge, is available to everyone. It's a tool, but there are plenty of providers out there willing to offer you good services out there for screening as well. So I wanted to break down denied restricted party lists. Really, the denied consists of you have restricted party lists where a license is required. You have denied parties where you cannot do business with these individuals, and then you have parties of concern. So you really break it down. And that's why I wanted to call restricted or sanctioned party lists rather than just denied. There are plenty of companies that are identified on the lists that we can continue to do business with once we clear whether a license requirement or we realize that what the reason why they are restricted is not applicable to us. So on the restricted, where a license is required, the most known is the Department of Commerce entity list. And this could be of any country, right? Don't assume that a company on entity list has to be in China, Russia. You can have companies on the entity list in Germany, Brazil, Mexico, Canada. All they had to do is they had been found to be doing something illegal that to a certain point, and could potentially be added to this list. There are other general prohibition orders, and the Department of Commerce also has a military end user list. These are restricted. They are not denied lists, meaning sometimes if you get a license, you can ship to this company in China. Or there's a company that they cannot get super level computers, but all you selling them is plastics. Well, they are restricted for a certain thing that you are not providing, so that is not applicable to you. So even though they are on a entity list, you may bypass some military and user lists. If you're not selling military items or dual use items, you also may be okay to sell it to them. Then you have denied party lists, and the most common one is the denied persons list. So the United States government has identified companies, persons, and countries that we cannot conduct business with. You can't even get a license. And you're doing business with them may jeopardize your privileges to export, plus fines and penalties. So the entity list can be there as well. So the entity list, there are companies there that you are denied, where say, a license is required, and the assumption is you're gonna get denied. So it's pretty much restricted. There are lists provided by Department of Treasury and Department of State, Homeland Security, and so that's what gets complicated. I was trying to count for today how many lists are out there, And in the US alone, we have over 70 lists together. And that's why going through a manual process becomes very hard. You either need to do consolidated screening or someone that does that for you, a provider. So here you have other lists like the European Union sanction list, the Japanese proliferation list, the UK has a list, Germany has a list, UN has lists. Those are to be considered as red flags, not something that is restricted. So if Japan put a party on their list, but that party is not on the US list, you are allowed to do business with them, but it should be treated as a red flag. Even that, the US has a list called unverified list. There's also red flag concerns where they given someone a license to export to receive a US commodity with the condition that a US attaché would be able to visit and verify that the product was being used for the purposes indicated in the license. And then when the U.S. person officer tried to visit the site, they were not allowed. They're not allowed entry to the facility, and so they go into this unverified list, which is a red flag, but is not a denied order. So those are the lists. So who needs to be screened? When they need to be screened? How often they need to be screened? Are really the key questions that a lot of people ask. So who needs to be screened? All parties to the transaction. So not just the person buying the product, but if you know who the ultimate end user is, then they all should also be screened. If the end user or if there's a third party that is related to the transaction as the payer, or he's just someone that has ownership or potential interest, you probably should screen them as well. So who needs to be screened? I would say all parties to the transaction. When they need to be screened, that depends on the method. So best practice is that you should screen them when they first show up, maybe at the quoting stages, when you receive an order, you could also screen. And then right before you ship, you should screen it again. Let's say it takes 3 months, 6 months from the time you got the order to the time that you are delivering, that you're shipping out. Within that 6 months, that company may be added to the entity list or the denied party list. So even though you did a screening at early on, now you're shipping, that could be an issue, right? Obviously, it's a lot easier if you have something embedded in your ERP system where you can create these automated screenings at key times of your transaction. If you have a web-based screening like I do currently, then for us, we typically right now we screen when the new part is created or when the new order comes in. Or something changes in the order. So if they did change the delivery to or a party to, and then we also screen for when we have red flags. So there's a whole different process to go to. So how often you need to screen? How often? As often as you can handle. Again, if it takes you 6 months to deliver a product, maybe you should screen it in between that time, find out the process. But there are times that we have customers that are trusted, reliable customers, even US customers, that we don't have any concerns, and we only screen them once a year. So we have a list of customers that we're not really concerned. Once a year, we'll pull them out and we screen them all, and suppliers as well, not just customers, to make sure that everything is okay. Everybody else, we screen it on a transactional basis. But again, how you screening, how often you screening, it has to do with, one, your risk appetite, and two, you have done a risk evaluation and your product has a lot of risk or low risk, and then you adjust your screening to that. Then when you do the screening, any potential match must be escalated, right? You have to have some instruction of what you're going to do with it. You are screened, you have a match or a potential match, right? Now you have to have someone that can review that result and make a determination. Oh, this person is on these minor list that doesn't interfere with me, or I need a license for in order to ship this person, or I'm just flat out refuse it. What I'm telling you is don't flat out just refuse to do business with a company because they showed up on a screening, because that may be it may be possible to do business with them even without a license, even though they showed up a list. So not all government lists are created equal. That's why I wanted to identify the 3 different levels. Like the last one is really just red flags. So you can probably continue to do business as long as it's properly identified.
Jose, I just had a question that came in, I think fairly interesting. As far as like your procedures and the folks that are doing screening, when it gets to that transaction and the shipment's going to go out, is that the shipping department that's doing the final screening and making sure it happens before that product leaves the dock? Or is that, who is that person generally that does it? Obviously, it could be many people, but when that shipment's going to leave the dock, should it be shipping that handles that final screening to make sure it occurs? If it's a package that is required to be screened, meaning it's not that one a year, customer that you trust that you've been doing business with a long time. It's that more of a high risk customer.
So in my company, I have an account for all customer service people, and the customer service and the procurement service will screen the transactions. If there is a need to screen at the time of shipping, they would go back to the customer service team and ask, or it come back to compliance and do that screening. So customer service for us or trade compliance are the key people to do the screening, but anyone else has a different one. Typically, I don't like to using the shipping as a secondary final screening is okay, but they should never be your first screening. Because if you already built the equipment, you already got the money from the customer, and now you're going to go and say, oh, we can't ship, that's too late for the shipping to be that. So that's like a last resort just to make sure you're not doing anything wrong. So you can give them access for them to screen as well in the shipping if there's a need, if there's a high risk there, or have them revert back to customer service or whoever is doing your screen.
Awesome. Thanks, Jose. I think just one other element to the question that was mentioned, as far as that final screening for shipping, they're the ones that are going to see it leave the dock. Do you typically advise shipping if it's going to a high risk country, if you have a list of those countries, that you want a final verification that the final screening happened? Let's say it's a sanctioned country or something to that extent.
Yeah, so definitely China is one of those for me. It was Russia was before the as well. However, we don't have much of a time frame right now between the time we take the order to the time we ship, so we don't do that double screening unless there is some changes in the order and the delivery that will trigger a rescreening. But if you have a long lead time between getting the order and shipping, then I would recommend you to do a rescreening.
Awesome. Thank you, Jose. Appreciate it.
You have, let's see, that was it as far as the screening. I can answer any questions that you have on that.
All right, Jose, I have a few questions, and then it looks like we might have one that's coming in the chat at this time.
Yeah.
So a client asked, they said, they say their freight forwarder does the screening for them. Is that generally good enough that their forwarder, hey, I trust my freight forwarder. They say they do the screening. I trust them. Is that a good strategy to have an approach?
Absolutely not. first of all, that's worse than having your shipping people screen, right? You already invested all the equipment. It may be your product is one that you can grab it and sell it to someone else, but you should never, no matter how good um, your logistics provider is, you should never pass on your compliance to them. It's the government is going to come to you. Like we discussed yesterday, you need to do your due diligence and you need to know your customer. And screening is part of your due diligence and knowing your customer. So you have to do it in-house. I do not. The reason why this freight forwarders do it for them is because they have the same requirement as you do. They're not doing it for you. But they don't know the customer or all the parties to the transaction that are not listed on the documents like you do. So it's your responsibility, never the freight forwarders.
Awesome. Thanks, Jose. And then the follow-up question to that, as far as for smaller companies that aren't going to pay for, these screening softwares, if they're using consolidated screening lists, what are some of the best practices when you're kind of keeping a log of that information? Are you using an Excel and logging it? Are you taking some screenshots at the time with date time stamps? If you had to do this manually, what are some of the best approaches to do screening?
Yeah, so that's one of the things, right? It's harder to prove that you've done it. Because with a service provider, I have a log, I have a report that tells me who's screening in my company, who's not. If they do going to the government website and just use the consolidated screening, I will not have that unless they do like a screenshot of the results and then document it, right? You still have to document that you've done the screening. That's the first thing they're going to check. Okay, when did this entity was added to the list, and when did you ship? Oh, they're already on the list. Did you screen? And that's like you have to show evidence that you screened, and at the time everything was fine, or that's the results. Show the results that you had. And if you had a match, but you decided that it was not good enough, then you have to explain your logic as well.
All right, here we go. Jose, another question. What happens if the manufacturer screens the customer, that entity or that individual is not there? The order takes about 6 months to complete, and at the time of shipment, the customer appears on the list, one of the lists. Obviously, the shipment can't go forward, but is there any insurance offered for such of an occurrence? And this individual said this actually happened to a company that they know.
Well, that happened to us as well. Where we were going to ship and then I don't know if there's a insurance offered for such an occasion. I mean, I know the US government doesn't care. I mean, they won't. All they're saying, you cannot do business with this company. And there have been, I've been in a position where a company have shipped something back to us for repair. This is a long time ago, and we repaired it. And then when we we're going to ship it back to the customer was on the list, and now we cannot return their own item that they had returned, and that was even more complicated. There is really no safeguard for this, and I there may be insurance offered. I think that's a good question to ask maybe Jeannie
I
on
can
that.
Yeah, Jose, what I'll do, I think really good question. Let me follow up with our contacts at XM Bank and let's see if a part of export credit insurance. Again, I'm not sure if that is something that could possibly be covered if that policy is in place and then this occurs, but I can follow up with everyone on that question and then provide a response.
There is insurance for payment for validation of payment. Make sure that you get paid. But what would you use in this is, you would go back to your contract and there'll be a force majeure, maybe application, or your contract maybe will have a clause that's saying that, if there's an ability to provide this because you did something bad, then it's on you. We get to keep your money and we get to keep our equipment and try to sell it. There's different ways, but I would have to revert back probably more to the contract, make sure things like that are listed on the contract rather than an insurance. But there may be an insurance option too.
I'll certainly follow up on that. I'll touch base with Rich Foy at XM and we'll see if we can get an answer. All right, here we go, Jose. Another question. So let's say you have a hit on one of the lists. It's not an exact hit, but it's a close hit on one of the restricted lists. What do you do in follow up to verify that the information you have matches that, let's say, individual entity, etc.? So it's a close match, but not a complete match.
Yeah, in my company, I have a whole training about how to interpret, right? You have false positives, um, John Smith. If you type John Smith, you potentially going to get all the Smiths. So you're going to start looking at addresses. Does the name match, or does the name partial match? Does the address match? So you start going down into the further matches, and I actually had to go back to certain customers and say, hey, is this you? Have you, are you related to this entity that is showing up? And they say, no. We get this a lot. Typically companies that are on the entity list or any kind of bad government list, they know they are. So they know what they've done. They're very aware that their supply chain is being affected because they've been put it on some kind of government list. So they know. So one of the first things, first you evaluate, is this a exact match, or is this a false positive? If it's a false positive, I just document it and move on. All right. Nuclear University of Bombay against Nuclear University of Berlin. All right, one of them is, I have a partial match, but the name is not the same. Or if it's a false positive, document it, release it. If it's an exact match, or if it's a close match, then you may have to look at the address. You may have to go back to the customer and validate. We have a match on our screening. Just wanted to verify, is this you or not? And if it is, then we explain and move on after that.